Hey, it's Rachel. We are headed towards our first fall frost, and I'm out here removing my frost tender vines from this bed. And the big mix of things on here made me think that I really should do a video, a quick one, dedicated to the design of this particular bed. At this point, I have a large kitchen garden with 10 beds, producing a good chunk of what we eat as a family. I'll put a link in the description to that full design for those that are interested. But most of those 10 beds are focused on growing just 1 or 2 crops that I put up and store for later. While this bed, in contrast, gives me almost all of my fresh eating crops, 17 different ones in total, across all 4 seasons of growing. If I had known, back when I first started growing and was focused on fresh eating, everything that I know now about vertical growing, microclimates, seasonal harvesting, and staggered plantings, this is the one bed I would have planted. So I figured it'd be helpful to share. I'm going to go through the construction of the bed itself and the cost associated with doing that, a detailed calendar view of what gets planted and harvested when, the bed layout with crop placement and spacing, and then towards the end I will touch briefly on the next big project for this, which is turning it into a high tunnel for the winter. All 10 of my raised beds are the same size, making my rotation easier. I used concrete blocks to define the edges, and they're 5 blocks wide by 17 blocks long, or about 7 feet by 23.5 feet, with a wood chip pathway down the middle for access to both growing areas. This bed is then covered by a cattle panel trellis made of 5 panels, each 16 feet long and a bit over 4 feet wide. I used 6 T-posts driven into the holes in the concrete blocks to support the trellis. The panels are connected to those posts with zip ties, and the whole thing can be easily disassembled and moved as needed. I will share the current build cost on this since I always get that question. In total, I need 44 blocks for the bed, 5 cattle panels, and 12 posts. At today's pricing in my part of the country, that works out to a bit less than $325. Plus any cost for soil and wood chips. I can get compost and wood chips for free at our township city yards as long as I shovel it myself. If you don't have that available, you can use a service like Chip Drop for the wood chips, and I've got a whole playlist of videos on different ways to create quality soil for free or close to free, and I'll link that in the description. Of course, $325 is not cheap, but this will last you for years. And as you'll see as I go, you can get a lot of food out of this to feed your family and make a significant impact on your grocery bill on an ongoing basis. I'll start building out the calendar view for you of planting and harvests. Each column here is a week, and I've color-coded a few weeks that have holidays in them that I use as milestones to remember key gardening tasks. St. Patrick's, Mother's Day, the 4th of July, National Lazy Day on August 10th, admittedly not a major holiday, but it helps me to remember things. Then Labor Day and Halloween. I'll use this view throughout. As reference, I'm growing in Southeast Michigan, Zone 6A, and my last spring frost is just before Mother's Day, while my first fall frost is just before Halloween. Your dates may need to shift depending on how your frost dates compare. This bed is used to grow kale and Brussels sprouts in my rotation the year before, and it has a layer of cover crop debris and leaves on it. So on St. Patrick's Day, I cut any remaining plants off at the soil level, leaving their roots to decompose, and then I rake off any remaining debris into my compost. I then use a stirrup hoe to weed the growing areas and create a fine seed bed, set up the cattle panel trellis, and I sow peas along both sides of it at the base. I grow a mix of Alaska early shelling peas to freeze, Sugar Magnolia snap peas, it's a nice heirloom purple type for fresh eating, and Frida's World snow peas for use in stir fries. But I'm counting all of this as one of my 17 crops, just peas. On the south half of the bed, I sow salad greens and beets in long strips laid out along my drip irrigation lines, leaving a 6-inch strip bare along the base of the trellis where those peas were planted. Here's an overhead view. I've got a total of 5 salad green crops in here: arugula, mustard, lettuce, chard, and spinach, plus a mix of golden and dark red beets. I really like arugula and mustard for their fast growth and slightly spicy flavor. I opt for giant red mustard for its deep purple color in salads. My go-to lettuce mix is 3 varieties that have held up well for me in the heat with slow bolting. Merlot, again for its deep purple color, along with bronze-tipped continuity, also referred to as Marvel of 4 Seasons, and the bright chartreuse green black-seeded Simpson. That mix gives me good heat tolerance plus a nice visual blend in my salads. Going back to the calendar view, I've marked that we plant all of these around St. Patrick's. The peas won't be ready to harvest for about 60 to 80 days, depending on the variety. My harvest runs from late May through about the 4th of July. Meanwhile, I can start picking spinach and chard at the baby leaf stage in April, continuing through June. The spinach starts to bolt on me and is gone by the 4th of July when our temperatures spike sharply. The beet harvest starts right around then and goes through Labor Day, while the chard just stays in place, sizes up, and keeps producing. Because of that specific crop timing, I've worked out a staggered planting strategy for the middle row of this bed. I start the chard and spinach as transplants and put them and my beet seeds in as alternating patterns spaced 6 inches apart. I try for a pattern of chard transplant, spinach transplant, beet seed, spinach transplant, and then repeating. It never, of course, works out perfectly, but that's the goal. I remove the spinach as it bolts, and by the end of June or the 4th of July, it's all gone, and the beets take over that space as they size up. By Labor Day, the beet harvest is done, and they're gone, leaving even more space in the row. And my chard ends up with about a 30-inch spacing on center, plenty of room to size up all the way to full maturity. It can survive down to 10 Fahrenheit or negative 12 Celsius, and I leave it in place into the winter. Admittedly, this does require some care during the transplanting process to get that pattern right, but with this approach, I can make very good use of that space in between the chard plants all through the spring, summer, and fall, and then have full-size plants ready to go by winter. Let's talk about the other 2 salad green rows with the lettuce, arugula, and mustard. I divide those rows into 4 equal blocks, and I plant them in waves about 2 weeks apart. So wave 1, 2, 3, and then 4. Looking at the calendar, the first wave, planted on St. Patrick's Day, gives me baby leaves starting in April, but then they'll eventually bolt in the heat of July, at which point I pull them out and reseed that block with the same crops. Those then won't be ready until around mid-August, or National Lazy Day, leaving around a 5-week gap with no greens. But if I add wave 2 to this calendar, and wave 3, and then wave 4, you can see that I am still harvesting from the later waves when the first one peters out, and then the first one starts back up as the other ones peter out. With the end result, shown here in a summary view, that I'll get a continuous harvest of anywhere from 1 to 5 different salad greens from April through November. By Mother's Day, those salad greens are all well established, and it's time to put in my summer vining crops all along the base of the trellis on both sides. That's why I left that 6-inch strip bare along the base of the trellis that I mentioned earlier. I go over that strip quickly with my stirrup hoe in between the pea plants to knock down any weeds that have sprung up since St. Patrick's. And then I put in my transplants along that inside edge of the trellis with some slow-release fertilizer in the planting hole. Those go in between the pea vines, and it's also when I sow my edamame plants on the other half of the bed. I'm often asked about the shade from this trellis. By the time the summer vining crops go in, the salad greens are well established, and they do just fine with the dappled shade that results when this eventually is covered in the vines. This doesn't really get covered for a couple of months, and by then the edamame has also sized up, and it will be just fine with the slightly dappled shade that comes on under this. And the salad greens, in fact, benefit from it because it delays their bolting as the temperatures increase. To give you a sense of spacing here, I'm showing what's placed on the trellis. I have one entire panel dedicated to spaghetti squash with one planted on each side of the trellis. Another panel dedicated to Lady Godiva pumpkins that I grow for their seeds, again, one on each side. The third panel has butternut squash, one on each side. The fourth panel is for Tromboncino squash. I have said this before, I will keep saying it, you do not need more than one Tromboncino plant in a garden. As long as this plant survives and you don't have crazy pest pressures, I don't care how much you like zucchini, you will never have the need for more than one Tromboncino plant. It will cover the entire panel happily, it would probably cover this entire trellis happily. I do try to prune it to contain it a bit, but just assume you have one plant and it will take up an entire panel. Finally, the last of my 5 trellises has 2 cherry tomatoes growing on one side of it. And if I spin around the view to show the other side of that last trellis, you can see that it has a fresh pole bean and a cucumber vine growing on it. I prune my cherry tomatoes and cucumbers down to 1 or 2 stems since they're so productive, and they don't need more than a 2-foot section on the trellis. That one bean I plant then climbs up around and through everything else and gives plenty of fresh beans for my family. If you are fortunate enough to be growing in a warmer climate than mine and or one with longer frost-free days, you could replace some of these vining crops with small fruited melon varieties that work on a trellis, like sugar baby watermelon, ambrosia or Minnesota midget, cantaloupe, and Kajari melon. I do grow those in another part of my garden under slitted row cover to make sure they get the heat that they need. If I could grow them on this trellis, I absolutely would. I will also note as you look at that spacing diagram, you could easily scale this whole thing up or down by removing or adding an additional cattle panel and removing or adding concrete blocks as needed. It's a pretty modular design and you can easily adjust it to your needs. One quick note for some extra credit, I will often sprinkle a good dose of mustard seed along the base of the trellis the same day that I transplant in those summer vining crops. It helps to suppress weeds, attracts pollinators, and can confuse pests with its strong scent. Some holy basil in the mix would take that up to an even better level. Back to the calendar view, I've marked what we planted on Mother's Day. My edamame harvest usually starts around mid-July and is over in 2 to 3 weeks. The vining crops produce over a much longer period with cherry tomatoes and the Tromboncino summer squash kicking in by late June, followed by my cucumbers and beans, and then the winter squash plants don't really reach maturity until late September. Moving along to the 4th of July, I'm not planting any crops as it's too hot here, but there are a couple of key things that I do to support a healthy soil and the dense plantings that you see in this bed. By the 4th of July, the peas are done with their harvest and I cut them off at the base. Their roots then break down and give those heavy feeders that are still growing on the trellis a boost of nitrogen as they decompose. Peas are in the legume family. and they form a symbiotic relationship with bacteria that colonize their roots and fix atmospheric nitrogen into a form that can be used by plants, and the peas in turn feed those bacteria with sugars exuded from their roots. Do not pull beans or peas out of the ground when you harvest them. Just cut them off at the base. As their roots break down in the soil, the nitrogen that they hold will be released and is in a form that is available and useful to subsequent plants. In this case, all of my summer vining crops that are still on the trellis, sucking nitrogen like crazy. In addition to cutting off the pea plants, I use the 4th of July as a reminder to stir up hoe around the edamame and then sow a mustard cover crop pretty heavily around the growing plants. This is a proper cover crop, pretty dense, and since it is staggered later than the mustard that I previously planted along the base of the trellis, it ensures continuous blooming to attract pollinators and confuse pests. By the time National Lazy Day rolls around in mid-August, the edamame has petered out, and I'll do my final harvest, and then cut them off at the ground just like I did with the peas, leaving the roots to decompose. It's also time to plant my winter carrots, and I interplant those in 2 rows between my existing salad greens. My other microclimate note here is that the shady microclimate at the base of those greens creates a nice moist environment and helps with the carrot seed germination. These crops also work well together because they have compatible non-competing root structures and leaf heights, and they can make full use of the soil depth and the space in the air above. Now that the last of the edamame is out of there, I crimp down the cover crop, fold a tarp in half, and leave it in place for about 3 weeks to thoroughly kill the cover crop until it is brown and crispy. Back to the calendar view, I've noted the edamame harvest and the terminating of the cover crop, along with the winter carrot planting. Those fall planted carrots take about 4 weeks longer to mature than spring planted carrots since the days are getting shorter and they receive less solar energy, and they will mature right around November 9th. When Labor Day rolls around, that tarp has thoroughly killed the cover crop, and I then use my bulb planter to transplant minuet Napa cabbage straight into the debris for later harvest during the winter. I've added that step to the calendar view here in the Labor Day column. That cabbage will also be fully mature right in early November. By Halloween, the frost tender vining crops have been harvested and removed. That's what I'm out here doing today. At this point, I add an insulating layer of leaves around the base of the mature plants to help shield them from winter temperatures, and I can convert the bed into a high tunnel for the winter. As mentioned, I'm only touching on this planned project briefly, since candidly I'm still kind of working it out, and I will eventually do an entire video on it. But my plan is to cover the cattle panel trellis in greenhouse plastic with zippered openings at each end, add a ridge beam and internal supports to ensure that the panels don't bow outwards or develop a saddle shape under heavy snow, and then cross my fingers and hope for the best. I'll talk about my very last key date, the start of my Persephone period. This is the day when your daylight drops below 10 hours in a 24-hour period, at which point plant growth and regrowth almost stops due to the absence of solar energy. For me, that happens on November 9th. I'll continue to harvest out of this bed as long as there are things to harvest, but they won't regrow. That's what drove the timing of my carrot and cabbage plantings. I wanted them to be fully mature by the time this day rolled around. They're both mature in early November, even with the days getting shorter, and are essentially held in cold storage in the bed. I've got a visual here of the lowest survivable temperatures for different crops, although in my experience it does depend quite a bit on the variety that you plant. I'll lose all of my frost tender plants around mid-October, and then without a cover on the bed, I'll lose the giant red mustard when we get down to 25 Fahrenheit in late November. The peas will already be removed, but the arugula and spinach will die off next, then the lettuce and carrots in mid-December, unless I heavily mulch them, as well as any beets that I didn't already harvest out of that row. Chard and cabbage will be the last to go in late December. My goal with the high tunnel is to moderate the temperatures in here and hopefully keep everything alive and held in cold storage and continue to harvest all the way until next February. That's when my day lengths increase to more than 10 hours a day and I can start to get regrowth and more harvest again out of the bed. And as long as it doesn't collapse, this should help not just with temperature, but also with making the harvesting process much more enjoyable for me, as opposed to digging under heavy loads of snow. Last important note on this bed, it's given us 17 different crops, and that's a major selling point for me already, but the other reason I love it for beginners is its plant family diversity. We can group these 17 crops by plant family, and you can see that we have 7 different families in here. This helps reduce pest pressure and reduces the risk of disease compared to when we planted big monocultures. It also helps to avoid point loads coming out of the soil of specific nutrients. And it means you likely could get away with growing this mix in the same bed year over year and not have to worry about rotations. The only risky crop would be the tomatoes, since Solanaceae plants can be prone to diseases. If you were worried about that one, you could always give that bed an off year and grow your tomatoes in a grow bag placed on a patio, or even a grow bag placed just outside of the trellis with a tomato still growing up it. The main goal is just to make sure that the roots of the tomato plants are not in the soil and give the soil a break to prevent diseases like verticillium wilt. But honestly, with all of the diversity going on in this bed, I think you'd be just fine. I hope that this design and planting sequence, or more importantly, the logic behind them, is a useful bit of inspiration for anybody just starting out. My goal was to show that you can get a wide array of fresh eating crops in a fairly efficient space, not just to help with your grocery bill, but also to build your confidence and excitement as you progress in your journey as a gardener. I will post a set of fully dimensioned plans along with all of the crop variety names on my website for sale for anybody that's interested in that level of detail. And I've put links in the description to the other videos that I mentioned. But otherwise, if you have any questions or comments, please do drop them below and I will do my best to respond promptly. Until next time, thanks.